Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be diving into a story about a landmark victory for First Nations children in Manitoba.
Yeah.
After a 14-year legal battle, a settlement has been reached guaranteeing these kids access to the disability services they deserve.
Wow. That's incredible. It's a truly remarkable outcome, and it really highlights the importance of perseverance and advocacy when it comes to Indigenous rights, particularly in healthcare.
We're basing this deep dive on an article from APTN News titled
Okay.
14-Year Fight for Disability Services Settled in Favor of First Nations Children in Manitoba.
Hmm.
And this case is about so much more than just legal proceedings.
Right.
It's about a mother's unwavering love for her son and her fight for his right to a better life.
Absolutely. This case really personalizes the struggles so many Indigenous families face when they're navigating the healthcare system,
Yeah.
which, let's be honest, is often riddled with systemic barriers and inequities.
So let's get to know the people at the heart of this story. Harriet Sumner-Pruden and her son Alfred, who they call Dewey. They're from Pinnamutang First Nation. And Dewey's journey is what sparked this incredible fight for justice.
Wow.
Just imagine he was repeatedly denied, delayed, and given inconsistent disability services compared to children living just off reserve
Oh, wow.
in non-First Nations communities.
It's a heartbreaking example of the disparity that exists in healthcare access for Indigenous children. And when you dig deeper, you realize that these disparities are often rooted in something called jurisdictional disputes.
Jurisdictional disputes. I know some of our listeners might not be familiar with that term. Can you break it down for us?
Of course. Essentially, jurisdictional disputes arise when the federal and provincial governments can't agree on who's responsible for funding and providing services, and Indigenous communities often get caught in the middle.
Right.
This confusion and lack of accountability can lead to delays and denials of essential services for Indigenous children, and that's exactly what happened to Dewey.
So this family had to fight tooth and nail for over a decade just to get Dewey the basic care he needed. But here's the incredible part. Their struggle led to a settlement agreement that will change the lives of countless First Nations children in Manitoba.
Yes. It's a significant victory, and I think it's crucial to understand the details.
Okay.
This agreement has two main components. The first is expanded eligibility for a range of services, including disability support and home care for all First Nations children living on reserve in Manitoba.
Wow. So we're talking about a major expansion of access to care for these kids. That's huge.
It really is. And the second component focuses on how these services will be delivered. The agreement mandates the creation of a working group with representatives from both the federal government and First Nations communities.
So it's not just about providing the services, but ensuring they're delivered in a way that's culturally appropriate and truly responsive to the needs of these communities.
Exactly.
And this is where Harriet's story gets even more powerful. You see in her statements, she doesn't just express relief at the settlement. She expresses genuine hope for positive change in the broader context of reconciliation. She sees this as a step towards a future where First Nations communities have a real voice in shaping the services their children receive.
That's amazing.
One of the things that struck me about Harriet's story is her strength and resilience. To keep fighting for 14 years facing setback after setback, it's truly inspiring.
It really is. It speaks volumes about the unwavering love of a mother fighting for her child's well-being. It reminds us that sometimes achieving justice requires unwavering persistence, especially when navigating systems that have historically marginalized Indigenous communities.
This case, while specific to Manitoba, brings up some bigger questions. How common are these jurisdictional disputes? Are other First Nations communities across Canada facing similar challenges when it comes to accessing essential services for their children?
That's an excellent question, and it's one we'll delve into further as we continue our deep dive. The reality is that this case in Manitoba is a microcosm of a much larger problem. The fight for equitable access to health care for Indigenous peoples has been going on for far too long, and unfortunately, these jurisdictional battles are a recurring theme.
It's heartbreaking to think that something as fundamental as healthcare can become so tangled up in bureaucracy and political disputes. And it makes me wonder about the emotional toll this takes on families who are just trying to get the support they need.
It's a significant burden, and one that's often compounded by historical trauma and distrust of government systems. That's why it's so important to acknowledge the emotional weight of this issue, not just the legal and political aspects.
Absolutely. And as we move forward in our discussion, I think it's important to keep that human element at the forefront. We're talking about real lives, real families, and real children who are impacted by these systemic issues.
Well said. And I think it's a good point to transition into a deeper exploration of how this settlement in Manitoba fits into the broader landscape of Indigenous healthcare in Canada. We'll examine the challenges that remain and the opportunities for meaningful change that this victory represents. So we talked about this incredible victory in Manitoba, but, a signed agreement doesn't magically fix everything overnight.
Exactly. It's like we've opened a door
Right.
to better healthcare access.
Yeah.
But now the hard work begins making sure that access is truly equitable and reaches every First Nations child who needs it.
Right. And remember Harriet's concerns about resources. Even with this expanded eligibility, if the funding and infrastructure aren't there to provide the services, it's a hollow victory.
So what does that mean for the working group? What are the key challenges they need to tackle to ensure this agreement actually translates into real change on the ground?
Well, first off, they need to address the chronic underfunding that's plagued Indigenous healthcare for decades. It's not just about throwing money at the problem, it's about investing in a way that empowers communities and ensures long-term sustainability.
I imagine that means going beyond just building clinics and hiring staff. It's about making sure those services are culturally relevant and meet the unique needs of each First Nation.
Absolutely. It's about partnering with communities, incorporating traditional healing practices, and training healthcare providers who are sensitive to cultural differences.
And this is where the second part of the agreement,
Right.
the part about First Nations involvement, becomes so crucial. It's not enough to just have good intentions. We need to ensure that First Nations communities are leading the way in shaping how these services are designed and delivered.
Exactly. It's a shift from a top-down approach to one that prioritizes self-determination and recognizes the inherent expertise within Indigenous communities.
This makes me think about Jordan's principle, which we touched on earlier. Can you remind our listeners what that is and how it connects to this case?
Of course, Jordan's principle is a legal principle that aims to ensure First Nations children have equitable access to government services without delay. It's named after Jordan River Anderson, a young boy from Norway House Cree Nation in Manitoba, who tragically passed away while waiting for the federal and provincial governments to decide who would pay for his home care.
His story is a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of jurisdictional disputes and the urgent need for a system that puts the well-being of Indigenous children first.
And that's why the settlement in Manitoba is so significant. It aligns perfectly with the spirit of Jordan's principle by prioritizing immediate access to essential services and removing bureaucratic roadblocks.
So while this settlement is a major step forward, it's also a reminder that we still have a long way to go in achieving true healthcare equity for Indigenous peoples across Canada.
You're absolutely right. This case is a microcosm of the systemic issues that need to be addressed. We can't keep fighting these battles on a case-by-case basis. We need to look at the root causes of healthcare inequities and work towards dismantling the systems that perpetuate them.
And that brings us back to our listeners. What role can each of us play in pushing for this much-needed systemic change?
Well, for starters, we can educate ourselves about the history of Indigenous healthcare in Canada. Understanding how we got here is crucial for figuring out how to move forward. There are so many incredible resources available, from books and documentaries to online articles and podcasts.
And for those who want to dive deeper into topics like Jordan's principle and the ongoing fight for Indigenous rights, I highly recommend checking out Timely Trends and News on YouTube. They break down complex issues in a really accessible and engaging way.
Absolutely. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to their channel to show your support and help spread their message. It really makes a difference.
Beyond education, we can also support organizations that are working to improve Indigenous health and well-being. There are fantastic grassroots initiatives, community-led projects, and advocacy groups doing amazing work on the ground.
Yes, and donating our time, money, or simply amplifying their voices can make a real difference. Every little bit helps.
And let's not underestimate the power of holding our elected officials accountable. We need to demand that they prioritize Indigenous healthcare and support policies that promote equity and justice. Writing letters, making phone calls, participating in peaceful protests. These actions can create real pressure for change.
Absolutely. We all have a role to play in building a better future for Indigenous communities. It's about taking that knowledge we gain and turning it into action.
This conversation has really highlighted how much work still needs to be done to achieve true healthcare equity for Indigenous peoples. But what heartens me is that change is possible. This victory in Manitoba proves that. It's about persistent advocacy, community mobilization, and holding those in power accountable.
Well said. And while the journey toward reconciliation is long and often challenging, this case offers a glimmer of hope, a testament to the power of collective action and the unwavering spirit of Indigenous communities.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I
Hmm.
keep thinking about Dewey.
Yeah.
He's an adult now, so he won't directly benefit from this settlement, but it's impossible not to feel the ripple effects of his family's 14-year fight.
It's true. His story might be the catalyst, but this victory ripples outwards. Think about all the First Nations children born in Manitoba from this point on. They'll grow up knowing they have the same right to essential services as any other child in the province. That's a legacy that goes far beyond one individual.
It's not just about the practical services.
Right.
It's about what that access represents.
Right.
Dignity, respect, a sense of belonging
Absolutely.
within the larger Canadian society.
Precisely. It's about acknowledging the injustices of the past and taking concrete steps to create a more equitable future. In a way, this settlement is about fulfilling the promises made in treaties, promises that were ignored or broken for far too long.
That brings to mind something Harriet said that really resonated with me. She talked about her ancestors and their role in those original treaty signings. This victory, she said, is about honoring their legacy and ensuring a better future for generations to come.
That's a powerful way to frame it. It connects this legal victory to a much deeper historical struggle for recognition and self-determination.
It's a reminder that this fight for equity didn't begin with Dewey's case, and it won't end here. There's still so much work to be done to ensure that Indigenous communities across Canada have access to the healthcare and support they deserve.
Absolutely. But it's important to acknowledge the progress that has been made. Cases like this demonstrate that change is possible. It might be slow, it might be hard-fought, but with persistence and collective action, we can chip away at these systemic injustices.
This deep dive has been a whirlwind of emotions. From the anger at the injustice Dewey and his family faced, to the admiration for Harriet's unwavering determination, to the hope this settlement represents for the future.
It is, and that mix of emotions is exactly what makes this story so compelling. It's a reminder that these aren't just abstract policy issues, they're about real people, real families, and real lives.
So as we leave this conversation, I hope our listeners are left with a sense of possibility, a belief that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges, positive change is achievable.
And that each of us has a role to play in that change, whether it's educating ourselves, supporting Indigenous-led organizations, or holding our elected officials accountable. We can all contribute to creating a more just and equitable future.
If there's one thing I want our listeners to take away from this episode, it's this. Never underestimate the power of one voice, one story, one act of courage to spark a movement for change. Dewey's story is a testament to that power, and it's an inspiration to us all.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's a good time to remind our listeners about a fantastic resource where they can continue learning and engaging with Indigenous issues.
For anyone who wants to delve deeper into topics like Jordan's Principle, Indigenous healthcare, and the fight for self-determination, be sure to check out Timely Trends in News on YouTube.
They're doing incredible work to raise awareness and amplify Indigenous voices. It's a must-subscribe for anyone who wants to stay informed and be part of the solution.
And don't forget to hit that like button and share their videos to help spread the word. Every action, no matter how small, contributes to building a better future for Indigenous communities.
Until next time, keep learning, keep listening, and keep fighting for what's right.